Hey, son, close your eyes for just a second. Picture a kitchen in the summer of 1953. The linoleum floor has a crack near the icebox that nobody ever fixed. The window above the sink is open. A box fan pushes hot air around the room. Something is simmering on the stove, and your grandmother is standing over it with a wooden spoon, doing something that, if she tried it today, would probably get her a stern letter from the health department. Tonight, we are going back into that kitchen, not to judge it, not to sanitize it, but to sit down at that enamel-topped table, drink something from a glass bottle, and learn the tricks that kept families fed, floors clean, counters spotless, and neighbors impressed before the government decided half of it was a crime. These are the kitchen secrets your grandparents never thought to write down, because they never imagined anyone would forget them, let alone outlaw them. We are talking about the hacks, the workarounds, the old country wisdom and pure stubborn ingenuity that lived inside American kitchens for decades and quietly disappeared sometime around the time plastic wrap became a personality. If you enjoy getting lost in stories like this one, we would love for you to hit that like button and subscribe. It keeps this little channel alive. And if you prefer to listen while you drift off or drive, or do the dishes the modern way, we are now on Spotify. Link is in the description. We are grateful you are here either way. Now, before we step all the way inside, let us ask the real questions. The important ones. The ones that have been haunting you since you found out your grandmother used to rub a raw potato on a cast iron pan and call it clean. Did she actually know something the internet is just now figuring out? Was there a reason every kitchen in 1955 smelled like wood smoke and lemon and something ancient and good? Why did bread never go stale in that house, but it starts growing a civilization in yours by Tuesday? How did a woman with 6 children, a coal stove, and a Sears catalog stretch a chicken into 4 separate meals and make every single one of them taste like Sunday? Why does the coffee your grandfather made in a banged-up percolator on a gas flame taste better in your memory than anything a machine the size of a toaster oven produces today? And what exactly was she doing with that bacon grease she kept in a tin can by the stove? And why, now that you are older, does it smell like the best thing you ever ate? It is 1953 now. The fan is still turning. The spoon is still moving. Something smells like onions, and something smells like soap, and something underneath both of those smells like time itself. And everything is about to make sense. Every kitchen had one. A tin can, usually an old coffee can or a lard bucket, sitting in the same spot on the stove, or the counter every single day of every year. You never threw it away. You never let it run out. You added to it every morning after the bacon came off the pan, pouring the warm amber fat through a strainer if you were careful or straight in if you were not. Your grandmother reached for it the way you reach for olive oil today, except she reached for it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, which she did, and which most of us no longer do. The tin had a permanence to it, a gravity. Other things in that kitchen came and went. Jars emptied and were refilled. Flour bags were used up and replaced. But the grease tin just kept going, fed a little each morning, drawn from a little each afternoon. A quiet economy that ran on its own without anyone having to think about it. The color of the fat told you something. Fresh bacon grease was pale gold and nearly clear. Older grease, from pork cooked darker, was deeper, almost brown, richer in flavor. Good for greasing a cast iron skillet before cornbread went in. Good for frying an egg when you wanted it to taste like something. You used it for the obvious things. You fried potatoes in it. You started onions in it before the soup base came together. You greased the pan for biscuits, and the bottom of those biscuits had a crust on them that no butter or vegetable oil has ever quite replicated. But the less obvious uses were where the tin really earned its place. You rubbed a thin coat of it on a squeaking hinge, and the squeak stopped. You worked it into the wooden handles of kitchen tools to keep them from cracking in the dry winter air. You rubbed it into cast iron after washing, which was the correct way to season cast iron and still is. You used it to grease the paper that lined a cake pan. You put a small amount in a hot skillet to pop popcorn, and the popcorn came out with a savory depth that microwave bags have been failing to achieve for 40 years. The tin was also quietly a record of the week. A family that had bacon every morning for a week had a full tin by Saturday. A family going through a lean stretch had a tin that was running low and was being used more carefully. You stretched it further by keeping the heat lower, by using less per cook, by choosing dishes that needed only a thin coat rather than a shallow fry. The tin was honest in a way that a refrigerator full of individual packages is not. It showed you exactly where you stood. Now here is the part that would cause a health inspector today to reach for a clipboard. That tin sat out at room temperature, uncovered half the time, near the heat of the stove. And nobody got sick from it, because fat does not spoil the way protein does. Bacon grease rendered and strained is shelf-stable, particularly in a kitchen that is cool at night and warm during the day. The old rule was to keep it away from water, because water introduced into hot fat caused spattering and could lead to rancidity over time. So you strained out the solids. You kept it reasonably dry. And it lasted. Today you can buy little ceramic crocks with lids and filters designed specifically for bacon grease storage, which means someone, somewhere, figured out that the old tin on the stove was worth bringing back. Your grandmother would find that very funny. She never stopped. There was no Teflon in that kitchen. There was cast iron, and there was more cast iron, and there was a skillet so old it might have crossed the Mississippi in a covered wagon and still showed up to make cornbread on a Tuesday without complaint. The care of that skillet was not a chore. It was closer to a religion. You did not put it in water. You did not use soap on it. You wiped it clean with a rag while it was still warm, rubbed a thin layer of fat over the surface, and put it back on the stove, or hung it on a hook where it would wait for morning like a good and faithful thing. The skillet your grandmother cooked on might have been her mother's before it was hers. That was not unusual. Cast iron, properly kept, does not wear out. It does not chip. It does not peel. It improves slowly over decades of use, building up layers of polymerized fat that form a surface smoother and more reliably nonstick than anything a factory applied to a pan in the 1980s. The older the skillet, the better it cooked, which meant that what your grandmother was handing down when she handed down that pan was not just a piece of equipment. It was 40 years of Saturday mornings. It was the memory of every piece of fried chicken, every pan of cornbread, every egg fried in the leftover fat of a Sunday bacon. All of that was in the pan. The rules were simple. Heat it slowly. Never shock it with cold water while it was still hot, because cast iron could crack, and the crack would run straight through 40 years of seasoning and leave you with two useless halves and a grief that was not entirely rational, but was entirely understandable. Dry it completely after any contact with water, because rust was the one enemy. If rust appeared, you scrubbed it with steel wool and coarse salt, rinsed it quickly, dried it on the burner over low heat, and oiled it again. The skillet forgave you. It always came back. You could bake in it. A cast iron skillet put into a hot oven will hold its heat longer than any baking dish, which meant that a skillet of cornbread went in and came out with a bottom crust so dark and even it looked almost deliberate. You could go from stovetop to oven in a single movement, no transferring, no second dish, which was the kind of efficiency a kitchen with limited equipment and no dishwasher deeply appreciated. A whole chicken could start breast side down in a hot skillet on the stove, and finish in the oven, the skin rendered and crackling, the pan full of drippings that became gravy before the bird had time to rest. There was also something about the weight of it. You knew when you picked it up that it was serious. A cast iron skillet commands respect in a way a lightweight aluminum pan does not. And the food cooked in it seems to understand this somehow. Steaks sear in it, potatoes crisp in it, eggs slide in it once the seasoning is built up enough. It does not lie to you about the heat. It is what it is, even and reliable, and it asks only that you treat it with the small amount of care it requires. Your grandmother treated hers like a member of the household, because in a working kitchen that never stopped, it basically was. Before the refrigerator became the center of every kitchen, there was the cellar, a cool, dark room below the house, or dug into a hillside where the temperature stayed low enough year-round to keep things that needed keeping. Root vegetables in crates of sand, crocks of pickled cabbage sealed with a weight and a cloth, jars of preserved tomatoes stacked in rows your grandmother could account for down to the last one. Walking into a root cellar in 1950 was like stepping into a library of food, organized and quiet and smelling of earth and vinegar and thyme. The temperature in a good cellar hovered between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit through the winter and climbed only a little in summer if the cellar was deep enough and the door was kept closed. That range was cold enough to slow the deterioration of most vegetables and cool enough to keep fermented and preserved foods stable without pushing them toward freezing. The cellar did what a refrigerator does, but passively, without electricity, without a compressor, without a monthly bill. It did it because of where it was built and how thick the walls were, and how far below the frost line the floor sat. Potatoes went in first, before the hard frost, packed loosely in wooden crates or in bins lined with clean straw. They needed airflow to keep from rotting and darkness to keep from sprouting, and a well-built cellar gave them both. Apples went in wrapped individually in newspaper, so that if one went bad, its rot would not travel to its neighbors. A precaution that sounds fussy until you have lost a bushel to a single spoiled apple and had to explain to 6 children why there was no apple pie until spring. Carrots went into crates of barely damp sand, which kept them crisp and sweet for months. Turnips, parsnips, beets, and cabbages all had their place. The crocks were something else entirely. A crock of sauerkraut, packed tight with salted shredded cabbage and pressed under a weight until the brine rose to cover it, fermented slowly in the cool dark into something that was simultaneously a preserved vegetable and a probiotic food, though nobody used that word at the time. They knew it was good for the stomach. They knew it kept through winter. They knew it tasted sour and sharp and perfect alongside a piece of pork, and that was enough. Pickled cucumbers in brine. Pickled green tomatoes at the end of the season when the frost arrived before the tomatoes had finished. Pickled eggs in a jar of beet juice that turned them an improbable deep pink. The cellar also held the canned goods, the jars that had been processed in the summer and stood in their rows like small amber windows showing you what August had looked like. Tomatoes, green beans, corn, peaches and syrup, apple butter in dark half-pint jars. You came down the cellar stairs in February and stood there in the cold and the quiet and counted what was left and calculated how far it would stretch and felt either relieved or worried depending on the count. Today, almost no one has a root cellar. We have refrigerators the size of small rooms and grocery stores open around the clock and no particular reason to plan further ahead than Thursday. But something was lost in that exchange. Not just the food, though the food was genuinely better. Something about knowing where things were and how long they would last and what it had taken to put them there. That knowledge had weight. It still does. Nobody in that kitchen threw away bread. The idea would have been absurd. The kind of thing that got you a look from your mother that you felt in your knees for a week. Bread that was going stale went into breadcrumbs, into stuffing, into bread pudding that was rich and sweet and eaten without apology. A slightly dry loaf got wrapped in a damp cloth and put near the warmth of the stove for a few minutes and came back softer than you expected. Nothing was wasted because nothing was cheap enough to waste. And the tricks they use to stretch a loaf across a week are so simple they almost feel like cheating. The bread itself was different to begin with. Homemade bread, or bread from a local bakery, had no preservatives and went stale faster than the bagged sandwich bread that would come to dominate the American pantry in the 1960s and 70s. Stalling was not the same as spoiling. A loaf could be stale and hard and completely safe to eat. And the women who baked that bread knew exactly what to do with it at every stage of its decline. The first day, you ate it fresh with butter. The second day, you made sandwiches. The third day, you toasted it. The fourth day, you had a decision to make. French toast was one answer. Stale bread soaked in beaten egg and milk and cooked in butter or bacon grease until it was golden on both sides and custardy in the middle was not a consolation prize. It was a destination, a thing people looked forward to. Something that was better made with bread that was 2 days past its prime than with bread that was fresh. Bread pudding was another. Torn, stale bread soaked in a custard of eggs and milk and sugar and vanilla, baked until it was just set in the middle and golden on top, could make something ceremonial out of what was otherwise going to end up as nothing. A splash of whiskey sauce over the top, if there was whiskey, and you had the kind of dessert that made people quiet in the way that good food makes people quiet. Breadcrumbs came from the loaves that had gone past toast and bread pudding into something drier and harder. You grated them or crumbled them and kept them in a jar with a tight lid. They went into meatloaf as a binder. They went on top of a casserole mixed with a little butter and browned under the oven's heat into a crust that gave the whole dish a reason. They went into the breading for fried things and kept the coating from sliding off, the way a too wet batter sometimes does. The damp cloth trick was real, and it works, and it takes 3 minutes. You take a clean kitchen towel, dampen it thoroughly with water, wring it until it is damp but not dripping, and wrap it around your stale loaf. Then you put the whole thing in an oven heated to 325 degrees for 8 to 10 minutes, or near the heat of a warming oven if that was what you had. The moisture from the cloth steams the bread gently from the outside, and when you unwrap it, the crust is soft, and the inside has come back enough to be worth eating. It does not taste brand new, but it tastes like bread again, and in a household where nothing was wasted, that was exactly enough. There is something worth sitting with here. We live now in a time when a loaf of bread goes into the trash because it is a few days old, because there is another loaf in the pantry, or because buying a new one is easy and cheap enough that the mental energy of dealing with the old one does not seem worth it. Your grandmother would not understand that calculus, not because she was virtuous, but because she had done the arithmetic differently her whole life, and in her arithmetic, throwing away bread that could still be saved was simply not a number that added up. Before the electric refrigerator made it to every house, there was the icebox, a wooden cabinet lined with tin, insulated with sawdust or cork, with a block of ice sitting in the top compartment keeping everything below it cool enough to be safe. The iceman came twice a week. Children would follow his truck in the summer heat hoping for chips of ice to suck on, which he usually gave them. The icebox required a kind of disciplined thinking about food that the modern refrigerator, with its abundance of cold space, has mostly erased. You put things in order of when they needed to be eaten. You knew what was in there. The icebox was not large. A standard family model held perhaps 3 or 4 cubic feet of usable space, which sounds impossibly small until you remember that the families using it were also using a root cellar, a pantry, a kitchen garden, and a canning shelf to manage what the icebox could not. The icebox handled the perishables, the things that needed genuine cold, dairy, cooked leftovers that would be eaten within a day, raw meat that would be cooked today or tomorrow and not later. Everything else had its own system. You shopped differently when you had an icebox. You shopped more often in smaller amounts for what you needed in the next 2 or 3 days. The daily marketing trip, stopping at the butcher and the vegetable stand and the dairy on the way home, was not a charming habit. It was a practical response to limited cold storage. You did not buy the week's meat on Sunday and forget about it. You bought what you would cook that day or the next and planned accordingly. The result was food that was fresh in a way that a refrigerator full of things purchased a week ago and slowly declining is not quite fresh, even though everything in it was refrigerated the whole time. The ice itself had a presence in the household. You could hear it working, the slow drip into the pan at the bottom of the icebox that had to be emptied daily, or it would overflow onto the kitchen floor in a small, cold flood that was nobody's favorite way to start a morning. The pan was one of those details of daily life that had to be attended to without being asked, like the fire that needed feeding or the lamp that needed trimming. The house ran because people in it paid attention to its small needs consistently without making a production of it. By the 1940s, electric refrigerators were in enough American homes that the Iceman's route was beginning to thin. By the mid-50s, the icebox was largely a memory. But the thinking habits it had produced did not disappear overnight. The women who had grown up with iceboxes and graduated to refrigerators still shopped frequently, still knew exactly what was in the cold storage, still thought about food in terms of when it needed to be eaten rather than how long it could be deferred. The refrigerator did not change their habits as much as it changed their grandchildren's. There is a particular kind of attention that a limited system demands of you. When the cold storage is small, you think carefully. When it is large, you stop thinking quite so carefully, and things accumulate in the back corners, and you find them weeks later and feel a mild guilt and throw them away. The icebox did not permit that. It held what it held, and you managed within that, and the management made you better at the whole enterprise. It is harder to find now, that particular kind of attention, but it has not entirely disappeared. Some people still keep it. Somewhere between 1955 and 1975, lard got a bad name. Scientists wrote papers. Margarine arrived in tubs with cheerful labels and promises about your heart. And slowly, reluctantly, the American kitchen traded out the fat that had been producing flaky pie crusts and crackling fried chicken since the founding of the Republic for something that turned out, decades later, to be considerably worse for you. Your grandmother never trusted margarine. She kept using lard, and her biscuits were, by every credible account, the best biscuits anyone in that family ever ate. She was not wrong. Lard is rendered pork fat, clarified and cooled into a white, firm solid that keeps reasonably well and performs in ways no other fat quite replicates. Its smoke point is high, which means it can get a pan genuinely hot before it starts to break down, which is exactly what you want when you are frying chicken or making a roux. It is not flavorless, but its flavor is neutral enough to stay in the background while it does its structural work. And in pastry, that structural work is the whole point. A pie crust made with lard is flaky in a way that no butter crust, no shortening crust, no combination of fats achieves in quite the same manner. The reason is molecular. Lard has a different fat crystal structure than butter or hydrogenated vegetable shortening, and those crystals, when worked into flour and chilled, produce distinct layers that separate and puff during baking into the kind of crust that shatters lightly under a fork before giving way to whatever is inside. Your grandmother made that crust by feel. She did not measure the lard precisely. She worked it into the flour between her fingers until it felt right. Added cold water a spoonful at a time until the dough just held together, and rolled it out on a floured board with a rolling pin that had been in the family as long as anyone could remember. The campaign against lard was in retrospect more about industry than science. The vegetable oil and margarine industries, which had expanded enormously during and after the Second World War, had both the financial motive and the marketing infrastructure to position their products as modern and healthy. The science at the time, incomplete as it turned out to be, offered them a foothold. Saturated fat, the argument went, raised cholesterol, which caused heart disease. Lard is high in saturated fat. Therefore, lard was dangerous. The argument was clean and simple and significantly more complicated in reality than it appeared on a margarine label. But it worked. Lard moved from the pantry staple to something associated with the past, with poverty, with people who did not know any better. What replaced it in the American kitchen was hydrogenated vegetable shortening, which was solid at room temperature because its manufacturers had pumped it full of hydrogen to change its physical properties, and which contained, as a byproduct of that process, trans fats. Trans fats, research eventually confirmed, are genuinely harmful in ways that lard, a naturally occurring animal fat eaten by human beings for thousands of years, is not. The irony would be funny if it had not taken 40 years and a great many people's health to arrive at. Today, lard is making a quiet comeback in certain kitchens. You can find it at farmers markets, rendered freshly from pastured pigs, sold in clean white containers by people who know exactly what it is and what it does. Your grandmother would not find this a revelation. She would find it sensible. She never understood what all the fuss was about. White vinegar lived under every kitchen sink and on every pantry shelf in America for most of the 20th century. And it did about 47 different jobs without asking for anything in return. It cleaned windows. It cut grease on stovetops. It descaled the coffee percolator. It kept ants off the counter. It rinsed produce. It preserved cucumbers, onions, beets, and eggs in jars that sat in the cellar and lasted all winter. A splash of it in the pot kept poached eggs together. It tenderized tough cuts of meat left to soak overnight. It was, in short, the Swiss Army knife of the American kitchen, and it cost almost nothing, which was the entire point. The large gallon jug of white vinegar was a staple in a way that is hard to overstate. It was not purchased occasionally. It was purchased the way you purchase dish soap or salt on a rotating basis, because it was always being used for something. The cooking applications alone were enough to justify its permanent place on the shelf. A tablespoon of white vinegar added to the water, when you poach eggs, creates a mild acidity in the water that helps the egg whites set quickly around the yolk, before the whole thing can disperse into those ragged white tendrils that less informed methods produce. A splash of it in the pot of beans helps soften the skins. A small amount added to the rinse water for leafy greens removed pesticide residue in the days before organic produce had a label or movement. Apple cider vinegar was the other bottle, slightly different in character, warmer in flavor, used more often in cooking proper. It went into coleslaw dressings and braised greens, and the liquid for pickling sweet onions that were sliced thin and put up in pint jars and brought out alongside winter roasts. It went into the brine for ham. It balanced the sweetness in baked beans. It was the acid note in a vinaigrette before the word vinaigrette was in wide use, when it was simply called salad dressing and was made at home, because buying it in a bottle at the store was not a thing most people did or thought to do. For cleaning, white vinegar worked because its mild acidity cuts through mineral deposits and alkaline residue, which is what most kitchen grime actually is. The ring inside a coffee percolator is mineral buildup from hard water. A solution of equal parts vinegar and water run through the machine once a week dissolved it without the need for any additional product, which is still exactly what the instructions on high-end espresso machines recommend, presented as though it were new information. Windows washed with a diluted vinegar solution and dried with a crumpled piece of newspaper. A trick your grandmother learned from her mother and thought nothing of. Produce a streak-free result that rivals anything in a blue spray bottle. The thing about vinegar is that it requires you to trust something that smells a little sharp and looks like water to do the job of multiple specialized products. That trust is harder to come by now. We have been trained to believe that effectiveness must be advertised, that a cleaning product must foam or bubble or smell of synthetic citrus to be working. Vinegar does none of those things. It just works, quietly and completely, the way things that have been working for centuries tend to do. There is a bottle of it under the sink in many kitchens right now, purchased for one specific use and mostly forgotten. Your grandmother would find a great deal more to do with it. Salt was not just something you shook over your food at the table. In the kitchen of 1950, salt was a working ingredient with a dozen different jobs. You packed meat in it to cure it. You drew moisture out of vegetables with it before cooking. You scrubbed a wooden cutting board with it and half a lemon to clean and deodorize at once. You kept a bowl of it near the stove and used your fingers to pinch it in, the way every cook worth trusting still does. Salt preserved things, cleaned things, and balanced flavors in ways that took years of standing next to someone who knew what they were doing to fully understand. The salt box or salt cellar sat near the stove, open, accessible, because the cook was reaching into it constantly and could not stop to unscrew a lid every time. The salt inside was coarse, often kosher salt or a coarse sea salt, and it was measured by feel, by the amount that fit between thumb and 2 fingers, a measurement that translated into something approximate and adjustable in a way that a measured half teaspoon does not quite allow. A cook who measured by feel was not being imprecise. She was being responsive, adjusting to the particular saltiness of this piece of meat, this batch of beans, this day's broth. The measurement lived in her hand. Salting meat before cooking was a technique that most serious home cooks understood even without the word brine attached to it. You rubbed salt over a piece of pork or a whole chicken and left it uncovered in the icebox overnight, or even on the counter on a cool morning. And in the morning, the salt had drawn moisture to the surface, dissolved, and been partially reabsorbed, carrying flavor deep into the meat. What came out of the oven the next day had a seasoning through it that surface salted meat never achieves, and a skin or crust that browned more readily and more evenly because the surface was drier. Your grandmother called it getting it ready. The food world later called it dry braining and wrote lengthy articles about it as though it were a discovery. Salting vegetables before cooking them is a technique that draws out excess moisture through osmosis, concentrating flavor and changing texture in controlled and useful ways. Cucumber sliced for a salad, salted and left in a colander for 20 minutes, sheds water and becomes firm and crisp in a way that unsalted cucumber does not. Eggplant treated the same way loses the bitterness that otherwise requires long cooking to tame. Cabbage salted before it goes into a coleslaw becomes tender without being cooked, which is what good coleslaw actually requires, and what the bags of pre-shredded cabbage dressed immediately before serving never quite deliver. The cutting board trick is so simple it almost disappears. You take your wooden board at the end of a week of use. It smells of onion and garlic and fish and whatever else you have cut on it. You spread a handful of coarse salt over the surface and cut a lemon in half and use the cut face of the lemon as your scrubbing pad, working the salt into the grain of the wood in small circles. The salt abrades gently. The lemon juice reacts with the salt and with the proteins and compounds left behind by the food. The smell lifts. The surface lightens. You wipe the board clean and let it stand on its edge to dry, and in the morning it smells like almost nothing, which is exactly correct. No soap required, no sanitizing spray, just salt and a lemon and a little effort, which is the complete recipe for a great deal of what worked in that kitchen. There was always a wooden spoon, or several, standing in a crock near the stove. They were not pretty. They were stained with decades of tomato sauce and caramel and stock. They had burned spots on their handles and hairline cracks from years of heat. And they were, by a significant margin, the most useful thing in the kitchen. They did not scratch pans. They did not melt. They did not conduct heat back into your hand the way a metal spoon did. They stirred and scraped and flipped and tasted and occasionally served as an instrument of discipline, depending on the household, and they lasted so long they became heirlooms. The reason a wooden spoon does not scratch a pan is that wood is softer than metal, which is obvious. But the implication of that softness matters more than it first appears. A scratched nonstick pan is a pan that is leaching its coating into your food. A scratched enamel pan is a pan that will eventually rust at the scratch. A wooden spoon, dragged across the bottom of either, leaves no mark, and over the course of a decade of daily cooking, that means the pan lasts. The spoon lasts too, though it requires a little care of its own. You did not put it in the dishwasher, because the heat and water of a dishwasher would split the wood within a few cycles. You washed it by hand, dried it quickly, and occasionally rubbed it with a little food-grade oil to keep the wood from drying out and cracking. That is the entirety of its maintenance. The wooden spoon was the tool you used to check a sauce. You dragged it through the pan and lifted it and watched how the liquid ran off the back. When it coated the spoon and ran off in a thick, slow stream rather than a thin, fast one, the sauce had reduced enough. No thermometer required, no timer, just the spoon and the observation, repeated dozens of times in dozens of kitchens until it became knowledge that lived in the wrist and the eye, rather than in any written place. It was also the tool of the tasting, which is the actual work of cooking that no recipe can fully replace. You stirred the soup and lifted the spoon to your lips and tasted. And from that tasting, you decided whether it needed more salt or more acid, or more thyme, or more of the herb that was growing in the pot on the windowsill. You tasted again after the adjustment. You stirred and tasted and adjusted until it was right. And right was not a number on a page, but a thing you knew when you encountered it. A thing your grandmother knew on the first try while you were still working toward it. The crock that held the spoons sat in the same spot on the counter for as long as anyone could remember. It was usually a wide-mouthed jar or a pottery crock, and it held the spoons and the spatulas and the ladle and the whisk, everything you needed within arm's reach of the stove. The arrangement was practical, and it was also, without anyone trying to make it so, a kind of portrait of the kitchen at work. You could tell a great deal about how a kitchen operated by looking at what was in that crock. A kitchen that cooked seriously had a serious crock. A kitchen that was getting by had a few bent spoons in a drawer and managed with those. The wooden spoon you reach for now, if you still use one, is probably not that different from the one standing in the crock by your grandmother's stove. That continuity is rarer than it seems. Most kitchen tools have changed completely since 1950. The wooden spoon has not changed at all. It was already exactly right. Nothing with bones left that kitchen without giving something back first. A roasted chicken carcass went into a pot of cold water with an onion, a few peppercorns, whatever herbs were growing out back, and it simmered on the back burner for hours until the water turned gold and tasted like something you wanted to drink from a cup. Ham bones went into beans. Beef knuckles went into the long, slow dark of a stock pot on a Sunday afternoon. The broth that came out of those pots was the foundation of a week of cooking, and it cost nothing because it was made from what most people today throw away without a second thought. The logic of the stock pot was the logic of the whole kitchen in miniature. Nothing was wasted that could be transformed. A carcass that had given you its meat on Sunday gave you its gelatin and its minerals and its deep, meaty sweetness on Monday, extracted slowly by heat and time and water into a liquid that made everything it touched taste more like itself. Soup made with good stock tastes like soup in a way that soup made with water and a bouillon cube does not. And the difference is not subtle. It is the difference between something that warms you and something that sustains you. And in a household where the soup pot was the most important pot, that distinction was understood without discussion. The technique was simple enough that calling it a technique feels like an overstatement. You put the bones in a pot. You covered them with cold water and brought it slowly to a simmer, skimming the gray foam that rose in the first few minutes, because that foam was protein scum and it would cloud the broth if left in. Then you added the aromatics, onion, halved and charred briefly over the flame, to add color, carrot, celery if there was any, a handful of peppercorns, a bay leaf from the jar in the pantry, whatever herbs were available. You did not salt the stock because you would be reducing it, concentrating it, using it in dishes that would be salted themselves, and to salt it at this stage was to risk over-salting everything it went into later. Then you left it alone. This was the part that required the most discipline, which is to say it required almost none. You turned the heat to its lowest point, put a lid on slightly askew to let steam escape without losing too much liquid, and let it go. Chicken stock needed 3 to 4 hours. Beef stock needed 6 to 8. A pressure cooker, which many kitchens had by the 1950s, could abbreviate that significantly, producing a rich, deep stock in an hour and a half that would have taken all afternoon on a conventional burner. Your grandmother chose based on what the day allowed, and the stock came out right either way. The finished stock was strained through a cloth or a fine strainer and put up in jars, or kept in a pot in the icebox. A good stock cooled overnight and produced a layer of fat on top that you skimmed off or left, depending on what you were making. Beneath that fat was the stock itself, and in a well-made stock, a stock with enough collagen extracted from the bones, it gelled when cold, quivered like mild jello when you tipped the jar, which was the sign of a stock that would give your soup body, your sauce cloths, your braising liquid a richness that only collagen provides. Today you can buy stock in a carton from the grocery store, and it is acceptable, and it is convenient, and it will do. But it does not gel. It does not have the depth that comes from a long Sunday afternoon and a set of bones that had already given everything they had to a roast and were asked for one more thing before they were done. What your grandmother made on that back burner was not a recipe. It was a practice, carried from one week into the next, continuous and economical and quietly extraordinary. Refrigerators came into wide use in the 1940s and 50s, but the people who used them had spent their whole lives keeping food without them, and the habits did not entirely disappear. Leafy greens were wrapped in a damp cloth before going into the icebox, which kept them crisp in a way that the sealed plastic bags we use today do not always manage to replicate. Root vegetables were kept in cool, dark places with good airflow rather than sealed in plastic. Herbs were stood upright in a glass of water like flowers in a vase. These were not folk remedies. They were observations about how food actually behaved, passed down from people who could not afford to let it go bad. The science underneath the damp cloth trick is straightforward, even if nobody in that kitchen was thinking about it in those terms. Leafy vegetables lose moisture through their cell walls continuously after they are harvested, and when that moisture drops below a certain level, the cells lose turgor pressure and the leaf wilts. A damp cloth wrapped around the greens creates a microenvironment of high humidity directly against the leaves, slowing that moisture loss without waterlogging the plant tissue the way submerging it would. The result is a head of lettuce or a bunch of spinach that stays crisp and usable for several days longer than it would sitting loose in a dry refrigerator drawer. This is also why a slightly wilted head of lettuce can be revived by soaking it in cold water for 20 minutes and then refrigerating it wrapped in a damp cloth. The cells rehydrate. The crispness returns. Something that was going to be thrown away becomes dinner again. Herbs were handled with a similar logic. A bunch of parsley or a clutch of fresh dill stood in a glass with an inch of cold water at the bottom, loosely covered with a cloth or a piece of waxed paper, kept refrigerated, lasted a week to 10 days without significant deterioration. Your grandmother did not have a plastic herb keeper with a water reservoir and a vented lid. She had a glass and a cloth and an understanding that fresh herbs were essentially cut flowers and needed to be treated accordingly. If you have ever bought a bunch of fresh herbs at the market on a Monday and watched them turn to slime in a sealed plastic bag by Wednesday, the glass of water method is worth trying. It works considerably better. Root vegetables stayed out of the refrigerator entirely in many households because the refrigerator was cold enough to convert some of the starches in potatoes to sugar, which changed their flavor and made them brown faster when cooked. Potatoes kept in a cool, dark cupboard away from onions, which emit a gas that accelerates sprouting, stayed firm and flavorless in the neutral way a potato should be neutral for weeks. Onions kept in a mesh bag hung in a dry, ventilated spot lasted a month or more without going soft. Garlic braided and hung near the kitchen window lasted the whole winter in a kitchen that got cold enough at night. The refrigerator was not the solution to every storage problem. It was one tool among several, and knowing when to use it and when not to was part of the knowledge that made that kitchen run. What is striking, looking back at these habits, is how little equipment they required. A cloth, a glass, a dark cupboard, a mesh bag. The tools were ordinary and the results were better than what most modern storage solutions, with their engineered plastics and climate-controlled drawers, consistently deliver. The knowledge was the technology. It always had been. A good knife in that kitchen was sharpened regularly on a whetstone and kept sharp by running it across the steel before every use. There were no knife blocks full of specialty blades. There was usually one good chef's knife, maybe a paring knife, a bread knife if the family was doing well. The knives were heavy and simple and cared for like tools, because that is what they were. A sharp knife, your grandmother would tell you without being asked, is safer than a dull one. She was right about this, and it is still true, and most people today own at least 7 knives, and none of them are sharp enough to do what they are supposed to do. The whetstone sat in a drawer or on the counter, usually a double-sided stone with a coarse grit on one face and a fine grit on the other. The coarse side took out nicks and reset a badly dulled edge. The fine side refined what the coarse side started, polishing the edge to a sharpness that would hold for weeks of regular use if the honing steel was used consistently in between sharpenings. The technique was not complicated, but it required learning, and it was learned the way most things in that kitchen were learned, by standing next to someone who knew what they were doing and watching their hands until your hands understood what your eyes were seeing. You held the blade at a consistent angle against the stone, somewhere between 15 and 20 degrees, depending on the knife and what it was made for. You drew it across the stone in a smooth arc from heel to tip, maintaining that angle with your wrist, applying light pressure on the forward stroke and lifting on the return. The sound changed as the edge developed, moving from a rough scraping to something finer and quieter. You tested the edge on the pad of your thumb, not across it, but along it, feeling for the slight catch that meant the steel was grabbing rather than skating, which meant the edge was there. Then you ran it across the steel, half a dozen light strokes per side, to align the microscopic teeth of the edge that the stone had raised. A knife that was maintained this way did not need to visit a professional sharpener more than once or twice a year at most, if that. The whetstone and the steel together kept the edge in working condition indefinitely. Most knives today visit a professional sharpener never, which is why they do not cut well, which is why people buy more knives in the hope that a new blade will solve a maintenance problem, which it does, briefly, until the new knife also goes unsharpened and joins the dull collection in the block. The paring knife in that kitchen was used for things a modern cook reaches for a cutting board and chef's knife to accomplish. Peeling an apple while holding it in your hand. Trimming the eyes from a potato while the potato turned in your palm. Cutting a small piece of meat away from a bone with a precise, controlled stroke that a larger blade could not make in that position. The paring knife required confidence in the knife and in the hand holding the food, a confidence that came from a blade that was genuinely sharp and a hand that had done the work long enough to know how to hold things safely. You learned by doing it. You cut yourself occasionally and learned from that too. The kitchen was not a place where incompetence was protected from its consequences. It was a place where competence was built, one careful motion at a time, until the knife in your hand felt less like a tool and more like an extension of the decision you were in the middle of making. Meat was expensive. It was not the centerpiece of every meal the way it became in the post-war prosperity of the 1950s, and even then, cooks who had come through the Depression did not stop thinking about it carefully. A pound of ground beef became a meatloaf that fed 6 when you added oats or breadcrumbs and an egg and whatever was in the ice box. A tough round steak braised low and slow in broth and onions for 3 hours came out tender enough to eat with a fork. Beans and salt pork together made a complete protein before anyone knew the word protein in that way. The tricks were practical, and they worked, and they produced food that people still dream about decades later. The meatloaf is the clearest example, and it deserves more credit than it usually receives. A meatloaf made with a pound of ground beef, a half cup of rolled oats, an egg, a diced onion, and whatever liquid was on hand, milk or broth or even water, mixed thoroughly and packed into a loaf pan and baked slow, was not a compromise. It was a solution that happened to be delicious. The oats or breadcrumbs absorbing the fat and the juices as the loaf cooked, keeping the interior moist in a way that an all-meat loaf often is not. The glaze on top, usually ketchup mixed with a little brown sugar and mustard, caramelized in the oven's heat into something that was sweet and tangy and very slightly smoky from the Maillard reaction working on the sugars. You ate it the first night with potatoes and the second day cold in a sandwich, and it was better cold, which is one of those truths about meatloaf that has never changed. Braising is the technique that turns cheap meat into something extraordinary, and your grandmother understood this with a completeness that most modern cooks are only beginning to rediscover. A tough cut, a chuck roast, or a round, or a shank has more connective tissue and more collagen than an expensive tender cut. That collagen, subjected to low heat and moisture over a long period, converts to gelatin, which lubricates the muscle fibers and produces a richness and a glossy, clinging quality in the braising liquid that no tender cut can replicate. You sear the meat first in hot fat to build flavor on its surface, then deglaze the pan with broth or wine or water, scraping up the fond, the dark stuck-on bits that are concentrated flavor and nothing else. Add aromatics, and then leave it alone in a low oven for as long as it needs. 3 hours for most cuts, 4 for something large. Time does the work that money would otherwise have to do. Beans carried the kitchen through the weeks when meat was scarce or expensive, or simply not on the menu for reasons of budget or calendar. A pot of pinto beans or navy beans started the night before in a bowl of cold water to soak, then drained and covered with fresh water and simmered slowly with a ham hock or a piece of salt pork, was a complete meal before it reached the table, needing only cornbread alongside it to make it whole. The salt pork flavored the beans throughout their long cooking and softened into something edible itself, if not glamorous. The pot liquor, the cooking liquid left in the pot after the beans were served, was not thrown away. It was sopped up with bread or saved for soup, because it carried the flavor of everything that had cooked in it and was too good to lose. What these techniques share is time, not skill exactly, and not expensive equipment. Time, and the willingness to use it in the service of food. That willingness is harder to find now, not because people are lazier, but because the day is structured differently and the options are more numerous. Your grandmother braised because she had a tough cut and a stove and an afternoon. The result tasted like patience, because it was. Ginger for a stomach that was not behaving. Cloves pressed into a tooth that ached while you waited to see whether the dentist was worth the cost. Peppermint tea for a headache. Garlic rubbed on a cut before the bandage went on. Honey on a burn, which turns out to be genuinely effective and has the modern science to back it up now, even though your great-grandmother did not wait for the science before she started doing it. The kitchen and the medicine cabinet overlapped in ways that made sense when pharmacies were not on every corner and a doctor's visit cost more than most families could easily spend. Ginger has been used as a remedy for nausea and digestive discomfort for thousands of years across dozens of cultures, which is the kind of longevity that suggests it is doing something real. The active compounds in ginger, gingerols, and shogaols have demonstrable effects on the digestive tract, reducing inflammation and easing the muscular contractions that produce nausea. Your grandmother did not know any of that. She knew that when a child's stomach was upset, you put a piece of fresh ginger in hot water with a little honey and had them drink it slowly, and it usually helped. She was right to do it. The tea she made was doing exactly what she thought it was doing, and the clinical studies published decades after her death confirmed it. Clove oil applied to a painful tooth is a legitimate temporary analgesic. The eugenol in cloves is a natural anesthetic and antibacterial compound, and dentists used it in formal preparations for most of the 20th century and still use derivatives of it today. Pressing a whole clove against an aching tooth, or dipping a small piece of cloth in clove oil and packing it against the gum, was not superstition. It was a reasonable first response to a situation that could not always be addressed immediately, in a time when dental care was expensive and sometimes simply unavailable. It dulled the pain enough to get through the day. That was the whole point. Honey on a burn works because honey is hygroscopic, meaning it draws moisture away from the environment and holds it, which keeps the surface of a burn moist in the way that promotes healing and reduces scarring. It is also naturally antimicrobial, with a low pH and hydrogen peroxide content that inhibits bacterial growth without the sting of the antiseptic solutions that would later replace it in most medicine cabinets. Modern wound care research has produced medical-grade honey preparations now used in hospitals for exactly these properties. Your grandmother applied it from a jar with a spoon, covered the burn with a clean cloth, and moved on. The results were the same. Garlic's antimicrobial properties are real, though less dramatic than the old kitchen remedies sometimes implied. Allicin, the compound produced when garlic is crushed or cut, has genuine antibacterial effects in laboratory settings and some effectiveness against common pathogens when applied topically. Rubbing a cut with raw garlic before bandaging it was not as effective as a modern antiseptic, but it was not nothing either, and in a household that did not have a well-stocked medicine cabinet, it was a reasonable use of what was available. What is notable about all of these remedies is not that they replaced real medicine. They did not pretend to. They were stopgaps, first responses, the things you did while you decided whether the situation was serious enough to warrant a doctor. They required paying attention to what was in your kitchen and knowing what each thing was capable of. That knowledge was part of what it meant to run a household, to be the person who knew what to reach for when someone needed something. It lived in the kitchen because that was where the ingredients were. It was practical and it was humble, and a good deal of it still works. Canning season in the summer was not optional. It was the work that stood between your family and a hungry February. You started in July with strawberry jam and moved through August and September, taking in tomatoes, corn, green beans, peaches, pickles, and apple butter in a procession that filled the cellar shelves one jar at a time. The pressure canner hissed on the stove. The kitchen steamed. Jars clinked and pinged as they sealed, and each ping was something between a receipt and a small victory. To have a full cellar going into winter was to have done something real, something that the act of ordering groceries online at 2 a.m. does not quite replicate. The process was communal in many households. Women worked together, a neighbor coming over with bushels of tomatoes from her garden, both of them working through the afternoon at the same table, processing and packing and checking seals, while children played nearby or were enlisted to sort, wash, and carry. The conversation that happened across that table was not separate from the work. It was part of it, woven into the rhythm of lifting and filling and wiping jar rims clean before the lids went on. By the end of the afternoon, a stack of jars sat cooling on the counter, and 2 women knew each other considerably better than they had that morning. The tomatoes were the centerpiece of most canning operations in most American kitchens. You blanched them briefly in boiling water, the skin splitting and peeling away, with almost no effort, then packed them into hot jars with a teaspoon of salt and a splash of lemon juice to ensure the acidity was high enough for safe water bath canning. The lids went on finger-tight, not forced, because the seal needed room for the air inside to expand and push out during processing. The jars went into the canner submerged in boiling water for the prescribed time, and when they came out and cooled on the counter, you listened for the ping of each lid pulling down as the vacuum seal formed. Each ping was audible and each one mattered. A lid that did not ping had not sealed and went into the refrigerator to be used first. Green beans required a pressure canner rather than a water bath because their low acidity made them susceptible to botulism if processed at temperatures that boiling water alone could achieve. The pressure canner raised the temperature inside to 240 degrees Fahrenheit, high enough to destroy the botulinum spores that water bath canning could not touch. Your grandmother treated the pressure canner with respect and some wariness, because a pressure canner that was not properly maintained or that had a faulty seal could behave badly, and in the confined space of a kitchen, badly was a significant understatement. She checked the gasket before every use. She watched the pressure gauge. She never walked away from it while it was processing. This was not anxiety. It was competence. The apple butter came at the end of the season, usually in October, made from the windfall apples and the ones that were too bruised or irregular to store whole. You peeled and cored and cooked them down slowly in a wide, heavy pot with sugar and cider and cinnamon and cloves until the mass reduced by more than half and turned a deep, glossy brown and fell from the spoon in thick ribbons. The whole house smelled of it for a day and a half, a smell so specific and so good that people who grew up in houses where apple butter was made can reconstruct it entirely from memory decades later without any prompting at all. That smell is still there in some kitchens in some Octobers. And in those kitchens, someone is still listening for the ping. The dishwater in that kitchen was not wasted. You washed in one tub and rinsed in another, and when you were done, the wash water went on the garden or down the drain, but never without squeezing every bit of use out of it first. Pots were soaked, not scrubbed raw. Cast iron was wiped, not washed. Dishes were dried and put away the same day because counter space was limited and because leaving dishes in a pile was the kind of thing your mother noticed. The economy of water was not a political statement. It was just practical. Water cost money, or it came from a well that required effort, and neither of those things encouraged waste. The two-basin system was standard in kitchens before the dishwasher arrived and remained common well after, because it worked better than a single sink when you were washing a meal's worth of dishes by hand. The first basin held hot soapy water, as hot as your hands could tolerate, which was the actual cleaning agent. The second held clean hot water for rinsing, refreshed periodically as it cooled or clouded. Glasses went in first, while the water was hottest and cleanest. Then plates, then the heavier items, pots and pans, which went in last because they were dirtiest, and by then the water was ready to be retired. The order was not arbitrary. It minimized the number of times you had to change the water and maximized the cleaning power of each basin through the cycle. Soaking a pot that had something stuck to it was not laziness. It was efficiency. A pot with dried-on starch or caramelized sugar that was filled with hot water and left for 20 minutes while you ate dinner cleaned up with a fraction of the effort it would have taken dry. The heat and moisture loosened whatever was stuck at a molecular level, softening the bond between the food and the pan surface without any abrasive action that might damage the pan. Your grandmother understood this not in those terms, but in the simple terms of experience. Soaking works, and scrubbing a dry pan is a waste of time and energy, and sometimes the pan. The garden got the wash water in summer. The soapy water from the first basin poured around the base of tomato plants and squash vines that had not been rained on in a week. The soap in the water was biodegradable, a simple bar soap or a mild flaked soap, not the synthetic detergents that would replace them by the 1960s and that were not safe to put directly on plants. The wash water brought moisture and the slight fertilizing effect of whatever had been washed off the dishes. Nothing was lost that could be used. Drying dishes immediately, rather than leaving them in a rack to air dry, was partly about counter space and partly about the principle that a thing begun should be finished. A kitchen in which the morning dishes were still in the rack at noon was a kitchen that was behind, and being behind in a kitchen that ran continuously meant that the next meal was already complicated before it started. You washed after breakfast. You dried after breakfast. The counter was clear by the time you needed it for lunch. That cycle, maintained without particular effort because it was simply what you did, kept the kitchen functional throughout the day in a way that leaving things until later never quite managed. Today, the dishwasher handles most of this and handles it well, and there is nothing wrong with that. But the discipline that the hand-washing kitchen produced, the attention to what was clean and what was dirty and what needed doing now rather than later, was not just about dishes. It was a way of thinking about a working space that kept the work moving forward. It is the kind of discipline that still serves in any kitchen with or without a machine to help. Butter was real and it was managed. You kept it at room temperature in a covered dish, because cold butter does not spread and cold butter does not bake the way butter should. And the people in that kitchen knew this the way they knew their own names. When butter was running low, you stretched it. You whipped air into it. You mixed it with a little warm water and salt if times were genuinely tight. You used it where it mattered most and substituted where it mattered less. And you never, not once, considered that a tub of bright yellow spreadable product made from hydrogenated plant oil was a reasonable substitute, because it was not. The butter dish sat on the counter or on the table, covered, in all but the hottest summer weather. A covered butter dish keeps butter fresh at room temperature for several days, longer in a cool kitchen, because the cover limits the butter's exposure to air and light, both of which accelerate oxidation and rancidity. Salt retards that process further, which is why salted butter keeps longer at room temperature than unsalted, and why the butter your grandmother kept on the counter was almost certainly salted. It was soft, always, because it was always at room temperature, which meant it spread without tearing bread and incorporated smoothly into batters without needing to be softened in advance. This seems like a small thing until you have tried to cream cold butter into sugar, and understand exactly how much energy and time the room temperature habit saves. Whipped butter was a technique for making a small amount of butter go further without changing what it was. You took softened butter and beat air into it with a fork or a hand beater until it was pale and fluffy and roughly doubled in volume. The air changed the texture, but not the flavor, and a tablespoon of whipped butter spread further than a tablespoon of unwhipped butter because the air took up space where fat would otherwise have been. Restaurants use this technique to lower their butter cost without appearing to serve less, which your grandmother would have found either clever or dishonest depending on her mood. In her own kitchen, she used it because it worked, and because there was no virtue in being wasteful when you could be resourceful instead. The water-extended butter technique was for genuinely lean times and required care, because adding water to fat is not a thing fat naturally wants to do. You started with softened butter, beaten smooth, and added warm salted water, a tablespoon at a time, beating continuously until the water was incorporated and you had something that was still recognizably butter in flavor, but was lighter in texture and went further on a slice of bread. The result was closer to what some European countries call beurre allégé, lighter butter, a product now sold in stores at a premium for health reasons, which your grandmother made at home for economic ones. The goals were different, but the product was similar. In baking, butter was used where its flavor and fat content were structurally necessary. In a pie crust, butter contributed both flakiness and a rich dairy flavor that shortening could approximate but not replicate. In a cake, butter creamed with sugar created a structure of tiny air bubbles that gave the crumb its lightness. In a beurre blanc or a pan sauce, cold butter whisked in at the end emulsified the sauce and gave it a glossy, velvety texture that no other fat produces. In these applications, your grandmother did not stretch or substitute. She used the real thing in the amount the recipe required, because she understood that there were places where the butter was the point and places where it was not, and she knew the difference. That discrimination, knowing when to be generous and when to be careful, when the ingredient matters and when the technique matters more, is one of the things a kitchen teaches over years of paying attention. It is not written down anywhere in particular. It accumulates in the hand and the eye and the tongue until it becomes something you know without having to think about it. Then you know it and you use it, and eventually you pass it to someone standing beside you at the stove who is just beginning to learn. The percolator sat on the back burner all morning and sometimes into the afternoon, and the coffee it produced was strong and dark and slightly bitter in the way that made you feel you had done something serious by drinking it. You did not throw out the grounds after one use. You stretched them, added a fresh scoop to yesterday's grounds to get another pot. A trick that sounds terrible until you realize the coffee it produced was not as weak as you would expect. Eggshells went into the grounds because the calcium in the shell cut the bitterness. A pinch of salt did the same thing. These were not coffee shop techniques. They were the result of paying attention to the same pot for 30 years. The percolator itself operated on a principle that modern coffee makers have largely abandoned in favor of other methods, and not entirely without reason. Boiling water was forced up through a tube and sprayed over the grounds repeatedly, cycling through the grounds multiple times as the pot heated. This meant that by the time the percolator had finished, the coffee was hot, strong, and had been in contact with the grounds considerably longer than a drip machine allows. It also meant that if you left it on the heat too long, the coffee could become bitter from over-extraction. Your grandmother knew this and managed it by keeping the heat low once the coffee had finished percolating and by serving it before it sat too long. The narrow window was not a problem if you knew the machine the way she knew hers. Stretching the grounds worked, because a portion of the flavor compounds in coffee grounds are not fully extracted in the first brew. A fresh scoop added to the previous pot's grounds brought enough new extraction potential to produce a second pot that was not as full-flavored as the first, but was entirely drinkable, dark, and sufficiently caffeinated to accomplish what coffee is supposed to accomplish in the morning. This was the practical economics of a household where coffee was a daily necessity and the grocery budget was not unlimited. It was not a shortcut. It was an observation about extraction, arrived at through daily experience rather than chemistry. The eggshell trick has a legitimate basis that has been confirmed repeatedly by food scientists and then confirmed again and then written about in magazines as though it were newly discovered every 5 years. Eggshells are calcium carbonate, which is alkaline. Coffee is acidic. Alkaline and acid neutralize each other, which is why adding ground eggshells or a clean eggshell to the coffee grounds before brewing reduces the perceived bitterness and sharpness in the finished cup, without reducing the caffeine or the coffee flavor. You rinsed the shell, crumbled it coarsely, added it to the grounds in the percolator basket, and brewed normally. The difference was not dramatic, but it was real, and in a household where the coffee was the beginning of every morning, real and not dramatic was exactly what was needed. Salt works for the same underlying reason, neutralizing some of the acidic compounds, but it acts faster because it is already dissolved. A literal pinch, 1/16 of a teaspoon or less, added to the grounds before brewing, smoothed the bitterness in a cup without making the coffee taste salty. This is a trick that has been in continuous circulation since at least the 1920s, repeatedly forgotten and rediscovered, and it works every time. If you have a bag of coffee that is too bitter, or a machine that runs a little hot and over-extracts, a pinch of salt in the grounds before brewing will improve the cup. Your grandmother knew this because someone told her, and she tried it and it worked, which was all the peer review she required. The coffee made in that kitchen was not sophisticated. It did not aspire to be. It was strong and it was hot, and it was there every morning without variation, which was more important than sophistication could ever be. It was the thing that meant the day had started, the thing that was handed to your grandfather without a word, in the same cup he always used. At the same time, he always sat down. Some rituals are not about the thing itself. They are about the fact of doing the thing. The coffee in that kitchen was both. This one strays a few steps out of the kitchen proper, but not as far as you might think. Starch was made in that kitchen, mixed from scratch with water and cornstarch into a thin liquid that you pressed into shirt collars and tablecloths and aprons before the iron went over them. The iron itself was heated on the stove in the old days, a heavy wedge of cast iron that you tested by holding near your cheek or spitting on its surface. Later came the electric iron, but the starch was still homemade because the homemade version worked better and cost almost nothing, and you had cornstarch in the pantry all ready for the gravy. Spray starch in an aerosol can arrived in American homes in the 1950s and became standard by the 1960s, and it was convenient, and it is still sold, and it does a reasonable job. But it does not do quite the same job as starch made from scratch, because the concentration is different and the application method is different, and the relationship between the woman making the starch and the garment she was pressing was different. The homemade version was mixed to a consistency that suited the fabric, thinner for fine cotton, heavier for collars and cuffs that needed to stand, and it was applied with a deliberateness that a spray can does not require or encourage. You mix 2 tablespoons of cornstarch into 2 cups of cold water, stirring until the starch was fully dissolved and there were no lumps, then transferred it to a bottle with a sprinkle top or a bowl with a cloth for dipping. You dampened the garment lightly, applied the starch to the areas that needed it, and let it soak in for a moment before the iron went over it. The heat of the iron activated the starch, bonding it to the fibers of the fabric and stiffening them into the shape the iron pressed them into. A collar starched this way held its shape through a full day of work in a way that an unstarched collar, even a pressed one, does not. The iron itself, in its oldest incarnation, was a remarkable object. A solid piece of cast iron, flat on the bottom with a handle on top, heated on the stove until it was hot enough to do the work, tested by touch or by the sizzle of moisture. You worked quickly because the iron cooled as you used it and eventually had to go back on the stove to reheat, which meant that ironing a shirt required a rhythm of pressing and reheating that was different from the continuous movement a modern electric iron allows. Most households had 2 irons for this reason, one on the fabric and one reheating, alternating between them so the work could proceed without stopping. The electric iron changed the rhythm, but not the principle. You still moved the iron in the direction of the grain of the fabric. You still worked collars and cuffs first, because they required the most attention and the hottest iron, and you wanted the iron at its hottest when it mattered most. You still pressed on the wrong side of dark fabrics to avoid leaving a shine, because the heat of the iron on the outside face of a dark garment could flatten the fibers to a mirror-like smoothness that showed every mark and movement. These were not rules written in any manual. They were the product of ruined garments and observation. And your grandmother had done enough of both to have arrived at the correct conclusions. The connection to the kitchen was the cornstarch, which appeared in the pantry for thickening sauces and puddings and gravies, and then went across the hall to stiffen the Sunday tablecloth. A migration that seems unremarkable in a household where everything had multiple uses and nothing was kept for one job only. The kitchen was the operational center of the house, and its supplies and its logic extended outward into everything else that needed doing. The iron and the starch were just the kitchen going about its business in a different room. Children in that kitchen were not spectators. By the time you were old enough to stand on a step stool and reach the counter, you had a job. You snapped beans. You peeled potatoes. You stirred things that needed stirring and fetched things that needed fetching, and were taught, early and without ceremony, that a kitchen was a working room and you were expected to contribute to what happened in it. The education that happened in that kitchen was not written down anywhere. It passed from hand to hand, from one person standing at a stove to a smaller person standing beside them, and it contained more practical knowledge about how to feed a human being than most cooking classes offered today. Snapping beans was where a great many children began. A bowl of fresh green beans, just brought in from the garden or bought at the market, sat in your lap while you worked through them one at a time, snapping off the stem end and the tip, breaking long beans in half or thirds, tossing them into a second bowl with a sound that accumulated into a kind of rhythm as the first bowl emptied. It was not complicated work, and it did not require supervision once you understood it, which meant it was work that could be done while the adults talked, while the radio played, while other things were happening in the room. You were in the kitchen. You were part of what was happening. You were not sent away. Peeling potatoes came next, a step up in responsibility because it required a peeler and a degree of manual coordination, and because a potato improperly peeled, hacked rather than shaved, wasted a significant amount of the vegetable along with its skin. You learned to hold the potato firmly, work the peeler in smooth downward strokes that took only the skin and a thin sliver of flesh below it, and rotate the potato continuously so that no patch was missed. The eyes were removed with the tip of the peeler, a small digging motion that you learned by watching and practiced until it became automatic. The peeled potatoes went into a bowl of cold water to keep them from browning, while the rest were finished, which was the first bit of food science you learned without knowing it was food science. Stirring was its own education. You stirred to keep things from sticking, which taught you that different things stuck at different rates and required different levels of attention. A pot of milk heating for pudding could go from fine to scorched on the bottom in the time it took you to look away, which you learned by looking away once and were not likely to forget. A pot of soup on a low simmer needed only an occasional pass. Polenta or a thick porridge needed constant work, the spoon dragged across the bottom and the sides of the pot in a continuous circuit to keep the dense mass from setting against the heat. Your arms learned what your mind was still catching up to. What the kitchen gave a child was competence, which is not a small thing. You knew how to do something useful. You knew that food did not appear but was made, that it required attention and time, and the correct sequence of actions in the correct order. You knew that if you started the onions too early, they would burn before the meat was ready, and if you started them too late, the whole meal was pushed back. And that timing in a kitchen was not a mystery, but a skill you built by doing it badly a few times and better after that. By the time you were old enough to cook a meal unsupervised, you had been cooking supervised for years. The transition was not a crossing of a threshold. It was a continuation of something already long underway. You stood at the stove, and the stove felt familiar. Because it was. Because you had been standing next to it since you were small enough to need a step stool. The kitchen had already made you. You were simply finishing the job. Clean in that kitchen did not smell like synthetic lemon or chemical pine. It smelled like vinegar drying on a surface. It smelled like baking soda mixed with warm water and worked into a cutting board with a rough cloth. It smelled like the wood smoke that had settled into the walls over years of winter fires. Floors were mopped with a bucket of hot water and a splash of something simple, and they were clean when you were done. The scrubbing was real, and the surfaces were genuinely clean afterward, and no one was marketing 17 different products to achieve what a rag and some elbow grease and a little vinegar had been doing without complaint since before anyone alive today was born. The cleaning arsenal in that kitchen was small enough to fit on a single shelf. A box of baking soda, a jug of white vinegar, a bar of plain soap, sometimes a soft soap made from lye and fat that came in a crock and was used for heavy work, a stiff-bristled brush for the floor, a softer brush for the sink, a collection of rags cut from worn-out clothing, hemmed neatly or left raw, used for wiping and drying and polishing, and then washed and used again. That was largely the whole of it. The multiplication of cleaning products into an entire cabinet, full of color-coded sprays and foam treatments, and antibacterial wipes and specialty solutions for every individual surface, is a phenomenon of the last 60 years. And the surfaces in that kitchen were no less clean for the absence of all of it. Baking soda cleaned because it was a mild abrasive and a mild alkali, and those two properties together made it useful on an enormous range of kitchen surfaces. Sprinkled into a sink and scrubbed with a damp cloth, it removed staining and odor without scratching the porcelain. Mixed with enough water to form a paste and applied to the inside of an oven, left for 20 minutes and then wiped away. It lifted baked-on grease and carbonized drips that steam and soap alone could not shift. Poured dry into a drain with a pour of vinegar after it, it produced a brief foaming reaction that scoured the drain walls and broke up the soft accumulations that slow a drain before they become the kind of blockage that requires a different conversation entirely. The floor was mopped with hot water and a small amount of washing soda or a splash of vinegar, depending on the type of floor and what it had accumulated over the week. Linoleum, which was the standard kitchen floor covering through most of the mid-century, cleaned well with mild solutions and was damaged by anything too harsh or too wet. You mopped in sections, working toward the door, wringing the mop well enough that the floor was damp rather than soaking, because a soaking wet linoleum floor took too long to dry and could lift at the seams over time if it was regularly overwet. You dried the floor with a second pass of a dry cloth or waited for the mild warmth of the kitchen to bring it dry in 20 minutes. Then it was clean, genuinely in a way you could smell, which was the smell of nothing, of a surface that had been returned to neutral. The walls above the stove required specific attention because cooking produces grease vapor that rises and settles on every surface within range. A weekly wipe with a cloth wrung out in hot vinegar water kept that accumulation from building into something that required real effort to remove. The trick, as with most maintenance, was regularity. A surface wiped weekly never became a surface that needed an afternoon's work. Your grandmother understood this as a simple equation. The work you did consistently was always less than the work you deferred. That equation has not changed. It will not change. The surfaces it applies to have only multiplied. What the smell of that clean kitchen offered underneath its practicality was a kind of reassurance. A kitchen that smelled of vinegar and plain soap and nothing artificial was a kitchen that had been attended to, that was ready, that would not let you down when you needed it. Cleanliness in that kitchen was not a performance for guests. It was a condition the kitchen was kept in, because the kitchen was a working room, and a working room functions better when it is maintained. That distinction between clean as performance and clean as function is one worth keeping. The kitchen does not care whether anyone is watching. It just works better when it is clean. In 1950, you did not eat strawberries in January, unless they came from a jar you put up yourself in July. You did not eat tomatoes in March unless they were canned. Corn was a summer thing. Squash was fall. Root vegetables carried you through the winter, and by February you were grateful for them in a way that is difficult to manufacture when you can buy whatever you want on any day of the year. Eating with the season was not a lifestyle choice. It was just reality. And the result of that reality was that when something came into season, it was an event, and you cooked it with an attention it deserved because you had been waiting for it. The first strawberries of June arrived in that kitchen the way something long awaited arrives, with a kind of ceremony that the strawberry available in December, pale and large and tasting of almost nothing, does not and cannot produce. You had not eaten a fresh strawberry since the previous June. You had eaten strawberry jam on your toast through the winter, and the jam was good, but it was a memory of the thing, not the thing itself. The first bowl of fresh strawberries sliced and left for 20 minutes with a little sugar to draw their juice, eaten over a piece of pound cake or simply by themselves with cream poured over them from a small pitcher, was not just dessert. It was a return. Something had come back that had been gone, and its coming back meant something. The tomato in August was the same. A tomato pulled from the vine in the morning, still warm from the sun, sliced thick and laid on a plate with nothing but salt and a little oil, was a different food entirely from the tomato available in November, bred for travel and shelf life rather than flavor, picked green and gassed to red in a warehouse somewhere between here and wherever it came from. Your grandmother did not think of the August tomato as superior to the November one as a matter of philosophy. She simply knew it was better because she had eaten both, and her tongue was not confused on the subject. Cooking with seasonal produce required you to know what each season held, and to plan your cooking around that knowledge rather than around a standing list of dishes you wanted to make. In spring, there were greens, tender lettuces and spinach and early peas and asparagus for the brief weeks it was available, eaten as often as possible because it would be gone before you were ready. In summer, the garden produced faster than you could sometimes keep up with, and preserving ran parallel to eating fresh, both happening at once. In fall, there were apples and root vegetables and the last of the summer crops, and you put up everything you could before the frost arrived. In winter, you ate what you had saved and waited for spring with patience that was also underneath it anticipation. That waiting produced a relationship with food that abundance has mostly dissolved. When you can have anything at any time, nothing arrives. When strawberries come only in June, June means strawberries, and the word June contains that meaning and carries it through every other month of the year. The season organized time in a way that a grocery store with global supply chains does not. It gave the year a shape that you could feel in the kitchen, in what was on the table, in what you had been eating recently, and what you were about to eat next. There are people who still eat this way, seasonally and locally, and with attention to what the particular month actually offers. They are choosing what your grandmother had no choice about, and the choosing makes it slightly different in character, even when the food is the same. But the food is often genuinely the same, bright and specific, and tasting of the place and time it came from, which is what food is supposed to taste like and what it does, when the season is allowed to have its say. No kitchen in that neighborhood operated in isolation. Recipes moved over fences and across back porches and between women standing in doorways with dish towels in their hands. A new neighbor arrived, and within a week someone had brought over a pie and learned in exchange something about how to make a particular thing that no one on the block had tried before. The recipe was never written down with measurements. It was described in handfuls and pinches, and until it looks right. And the person receiving it went home and made it 3 times until they had it. And then it became theirs. And then they passed it on. This is how most food knowledge actually traveled, for most of human history. Not through cookbooks, not through recipes printed in magazines, but through the physical demonstration and verbal description that happened between people who knew each other and cooked for each other and were interested in what the other person's table offered that their own did not. A cookbook was a supplement to that transmission, a reference for the dishes you could not learn directly from someone who already knew them. But the living tradition moved person to person, from hand to hand, and what it carried along with the technique was the particular character of the cook who taught it. Your grandmother's pie crust was not the same as the pie crust in any cookbook. It was the pie crust she had made 500 times, adjusted by experience to account for the particular flour she used and the particular icebox that kept her butter cold and the particular touch of her hands in the dough. When she described it to you, she described what she actually did, not what a general recipe would tell someone to do. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a pie crust that worked and a pie crust that worked in her hands specifically and that you would have to practice to translate into your own. The recipe cards that did exist in those kitchens were remarkable objects. Handwritten on index cards or cut from the back of a flour sack, stained with whatever had splashed on them during previous makings, annotated in the margins with corrections and substitutions, and notes written in different ink on different days. Use less sugar than it says. Good with applesauce instead of milk. Mother's version adds cardamom. These annotations were a record of the recipe in conversation with the cook over years, a document that accumulated meaning with each use. A recipe card passed down in a family was not just a recipe. It was a history of every time that dish had been made and by whom, and what they had discovered about it that the original writer had not known. The fence was the original internet in this one narrow sense. Information moved across it in both directions, informally and constantly, and what moved most readily was food. You smelled something coming from next door, and you asked about it. You brought something over in a covered dish, and you described how you made it while your neighbor tasted and asked questions. You learned from someone whose family had come from a different country and whose kitchen produced flavors yours had never encountered. And you brought those flavors home and adapted them to what you had and what your family would eat. And in that adaptation, something new was made that was neither what it had been in your neighbor's kitchen nor what it would have been in yours alone. That exchange produced the American kitchen in the end. Not any one tradition, but the constant movement between traditions, the borrowing and adapting and combining that happened wherever people of different backgrounds lived close enough to each other to smell each other's cooking. It is still happening. It has never stopped. The fence is different now, but the recipe still moves. Eggs in that kitchen were kept on the counter, not in the refrigerator, because fresh, unwashed eggs have a natural coating that keeps them safe at room temperature for weeks. A fact that most Americans today find alarming, because the eggs in their grocery store have been washed and refrigerated and must stay that way. Your grandmother knew her eggs. She held them up to a light to check for freshness. She lowered them into a bowl of water to see whether they floated, which meant they had turned or sank, which meant they were good. She cracked each one into a separate bowl before it went into the batter, a habit that took 10 extra seconds and once saved an entire birthday cake. She was not superstitious. She was paying attention. The coating on a freshly laid egg is called the bloom or the cuticle, a thin, naturally occurring film of protein that seals the approximately 8,000 microscopic pores in the eggshell and prevents bacteria from entering and moisture from escaping. An egg with its bloom intact is stable at room temperature for several weeks, which is why eggs sold in Europe and most of the rest of the world are kept unrefrigerated on grocery store shelves without any particular concern. American commercial eggs are washed before sale, a process that removes surface contamination but also removes the bloom entirely, after which the egg is vulnerable to bacterial infiltration and must be kept cold for safety. Your grandmother's eggs, which came from a neighbor's chickens or from a local farm and arrived without industrial washing, had their bloom, and they were safe on the counter, and she knew this because the eggs had always been on the counter, and everyone she knew was fine. The float test was not folklore. It works because an egg's air cell grows larger as the egg ages, as moisture slowly evaporates through the porous shell, and a larger air cell makes the egg more buoyant. A fresh egg dropped into water sinks immediately and lies flat on its side, because the air cell is small and the egg is dense. An egg a week or two old sinks, but tilts at an angle, the air cell end rising slightly. An egg that floats has an air cell large enough to lift it entirely, which means significant moisture loss and age, and you put it outside rather than in the batter. This test has been in use in one form or another for centuries and requires nothing but a bowl of water. It is still accurate. It still works. Cracking each egg separately into a small bowl before adding it to anything else is the habit of someone who has once cracked an egg directly into a batter or a sauce and found it bad, and who had to throw out everything that egg touched because there was no way to separate it from what it had ruined. A bad egg announces itself immediately and unmistakably when it is cracked, with a smell that is beyond arguing with. If it goes into its own small bowl first, you tip it away. Wash the bowl, use a fresh egg, and the cake is saved. If it goes directly into the bowl with your other eggs and your sugar and your flour, the conversation becomes considerably more difficult. Your grandmother cracked each egg separately, not because someone told her to, but because she had learned once what happened when she did not, and once was enough. That kind of learning, the kind that comes from a real consequence rather than a warning, is the most durable kind there is. It stays. The bowl stayed on the counter beside the mixing bowl for every cake she ever made after that. And she never had to explain why, because anyone who watched her cook long enough asked eventually, and she told the story, and they remembered it. And now you know it too. The egg is the most versatile thing in that kitchen, and possibly in any kitchen. It binds and leavens and emulsifies and enriches and sets and clarifies and coats and glazes and thickens, and in some preparations does several of these things simultaneously. Your grandmother used it in everything and wasted none of them, because an egg that was on its way out went into the scramble that morning, and an eggshell went into the coffee grounds, and the egg white that was left from the custard went into the meringue for the pie, and the yolk left from the meringue went into the noodle dough for Sunday. Nothing extra, nothing lost. The last thing the kitchen did each night was not cooking. It was the winding down. Leftovers went into covered bowls or wrapped in a cloth or a plate set over a pot. The stove was checked and checked again. The dish towels hung to dry. The floor got a quick once-over with the broom. The windows were cracked if it was warm enough, because a kitchen that breathed overnight was fresher in the morning. And then the light went off, and the room went quiet, and the smells of the day settled into the walls, and the wood and the enamel the way they always had, the way they always would. That kitchen would be there in the morning, warm, ready, holding everything it knew. The winding down of that kitchen was a ritual with its own sequence, as fixed and reliable as the sequence of the morning that had opened the day. Leftovers in that kitchen were not an afterthought. They were a plan. The pot of beans that had fed the family at dinner became the beans in tomorrow's soup, which would be thicker and richer for a night of sitting in their own broth. The roast that had come off the stove that evening would slice thinner and more cleanly cold, and the cold slices would be lunch with mustard and bread, and the bones left after that would go into the stock pot before the week was done. Nothing was put away carelessly, because nothing could afford to be. The covered bowl in the icebox was tomorrow's meal, and tomorrow's meal was not abstract. It was specific and counted on. The stove check was the last act of the working day, and it was taken seriously. A gas stove unchecked was a real concern in a house where everyone slept, and the windows were closed against the cold. You ran your hand over each burner knob and pressed it to confirm it was fully closed, and then you did it again, because the cost of being wrong was not a cost anyone in that kitchen was willing to pay. The oven door was opened and checked. The back burners were checked. Then the stove was checked again, briefly, at the kitchen door, before the light went out. This was not anxiety. It was the particular conscientiousness of someone responsible for a household, who understood that care and repetition were the same thing practiced over time. The dish towels were hung where the air could reach them, not folded damp into a drawer where they would sour overnight and smell of mildew by morning. A clean kitchen that smelled of mildew was not truly clean, and your grandmother's kitchen did not smell of mildew, because the towels were hung and the windows were cracked and the floor was dry before anyone went to bed. The morning that followed was the reward for the evening that had been done properly. You came downstairs to a kitchen that was ready, not a kitchen that needed attending to before the work of the day could begin. There is a quality to a kitchen that has been used well and put right that is different from a kitchen that is merely clean. A kitchen used well accumulates a kind of warmth in its surfaces, in the seasoning of its pans and the staining of its wooden tools and the particular smell of its walls, that is wood smoke and coffee and onion and years of bread. All of it layered and present and welcoming in a way that a kitchen that has never been truly used is not. Your grandmother's kitchen had that warmth. It was the warmth of something that had been needed and used and returned to and depended on every day, without exception, for as long as anyone in the family could remember. When you walk into a kitchen like that, even now, even in memory, you know immediately what kind of kitchen it is. You can feel it before you have opened a drawer or lifted a lid or put water on for anything. The room tells you. It says, people have been fed here. People have stood at this stove and learned something. People have sat at this table and eaten what was made at this stove. And the eating was good. And the table was the center of something that held year after year, through hard winters and good summers, and everything the years delivered. That was neither. That kitchen is not entirely gone. It lives in the habits of people who learned in it, in the wooden spoon still standing in its crock, in the cast iron still hanging on its hook, in the stock still simmering on a Sunday afternoon somewhere, made from bones that had nothing left to give except everything, in the particular smell of vinegar drying on a clean surface, in the ping of a jar sealing in the quiet of an August afternoon. It is still there. It never entirely left. It is waiting, as it always has, for morning. Nobody handed your grandmother a printed recipe card every time she stepped into the kitchen. Most of what she made from memory, from feel, from the accumulated knowledge of having stood at a stove long enough that the stove had stopped being a machine she operated and had become something closer to an extension of her own thinking. She knew what a proper biscuit dough felt like in her hands before she ever looked at it. She knew when a cake batter was right by the way it fell from the spoon. She knew the soup was done, not because a timer went off, but because the smell coming from the pot had shifted from raw and watery to something deep and rounded that meant the flavors had found each other. This was not magic. It was literacy. She had simply learned to read the food. The knowledge that lives in the hands is a different kind of knowledge from the knowledge that lives on a page, and the two do not always translate cleanly in either direction. A recipe that says add flour until the dough comes together is written by someone who knows what coming together looks and feels like, and it is useful only to someone who also knows, or who is willing to discover through repeated attempts what that phrase actually means in practice. Your grandmother had made the discovery. She had made it dozens of times, with dozens of different doughs, in different kitchens, with different flour from different bags, in different weather, because humidity affects dough in ways that a recipe written on a dry day in a different city cannot account for. And so the recipe was always a starting point and never a complete instruction. She adjusted without drama. If the biscuit dough was too wet, she added a little more flour without measuring, working it in with her fingers until the dough held together without sticking. If the soup was too salty, she added a potato, raw and quartered, to the pot and let it simmer for 20 minutes, the starch in the potato absorbing some of the excess salt before being fished out and discarded. If the cake batter looked too thin, she trusted what she saw over what the recipe said and held back the last few tablespoons of liquid. These were not improvisations born of recklessness. They were corrections born of understanding. The difference between following a map and knowing the territory. The recipes she did write down, when she wrote them down at all, were written in a shorthand that assumed the reader already knew the basics. Bake until done meant until your eye and your nose, and the toothpick you pressed into the center, told you it was done. Season to taste meant your taste, applied continuously throughout the cooking, not a measurement applied once at the end. A moderate oven was not a temperature, but a judgment, and the judgment was calibrated by experience to the particular oven in that particular kitchen, which ran a little hot on the left side and needed watching at the 40-minute mark for anything that browned. There is a freedom in cooking without a recipe that has nothing to do with abandon and everything to do with confidence. When you know the principles, the grammar of how heat and fat and acid and salt and time interact with food, you can improvise within those principles the way a musician improvises within a key. Your grandmother was not following a score. She was playing, seriously and skillfully, from a deep knowledge of the instrument. The kitchen was the instrument. The food that came out of it was the music. And on the evenings when everything came together exactly right, it was the kind of music that stayed with you. There was always a pantry. Not always a room, sometimes just a deep cupboard, or a set of shelves behind a curtain in a corner of the kitchen, but always a dedicated space where the dry goods and the preserved things and the bottles and the tins lived in an order that your grandmother could navigate in the dark if she needed to, and occasionally did. The pantry was not stocked randomly. It was stocked deliberately, based on a running inventory, kept not in a notebook, but in her head. A mental list that was updated automatically every time something was used and revised every time she walked past and glanced at the shelves. She knew what was in there. She knew when something was getting low. She did not run out of salt. The core of the pantry was the same in most kitchens across America in that era. Flour, sugar, salt, baking powder, baking soda, cornstarch, rolled oats, dried beans of several varieties, rice, coffee, tea, and whatever canned or preserved goods had been put up over the summer. Around that core orbited the more variable items, the things that were bought as needed or that reflected the particular cooking of that household: molasses, cocoa powder, vanilla extract, a tin of lard, a bottle of vinegar, a jar of honey, a can of evaporated milk kept for emergencies and for certain baking applications, where its concentrated richness did something that fresh milk did not. The flour came in large sacks, 25 or 50 pounds, because flour was used daily, and buying in quantity was cheaper per pound and meant fewer trips to the store. The sacks themselves were cotton, printed with patterns and colors, and they were saved after emptying and washed and repurposed as dish towels, aprons, pillowcases, and in households with children as the fabric for simple clothing. The flour sack dress was not a metaphor. It was a real garment worn by real children, and the manufacturers of flour knew it and began printing their sacks in patterns specifically chosen to appeal to the women who would be sewing with them, which was a form of marketing so practical and so honest it makes the current era's branded merchandise feel vaguely absurd by comparison. The pantry enforced a kind of planning that the modern kitchen, with its proximity to a grocery store open every hour of every day, no longer requires. If the pantry was out of baking powder, there was no quick trip to replace it. You used what you had. A combination of cream of tartar and baking soda could substitute for baking powder in a pinch, which your grandmother knew because she had learned it the hard way and filed it away permanently. Sour milk or buttermilk with baking soda produced the same leavening reaction that baking powder did in a different chemical pathway, which he also knew and used regularly because the pantry was a place you learned from as much as a place you drew from. The thinking that filled the pantry was the thinking of someone who cooked 3 meals a day and could not afford to be caught without what she needed. It was forward-looking in the specific, practical way that running a household demands. You did not buy what sounded good in the store. You bought what the week ahead required, and you filled in the gaps against the possibilities of a plan that changed, as plans do, when the weather turned, or the family's appetite surprised you, or the neighbor arrived unexpectedly at noon. The pantry was the margin that made flexibility possible. It was, in the most literal sense, the reserve. And a household with a good pantry was a household that could always feed whoever walked through its door. Somewhere in that kitchen there was a windowsill, and on that windowsill there were plants. Pots of parsley and chives and a small rosemary that had survived 3 winters by being brought inside each October before the first frost. A pot of mint that had been divided from the patch in the backyard and kept on the sill through the cold months, so there was always fresh mint for the tea. Your grandmother drank every afternoon without variation. Possibly a pot of something that had no name in English, but had a name in the language her own mother had spoken. Something brought over in a seed envelope tucked into a coat pocket and grown on every windowsill in every house the family had occupied since arriving in this country. The window garden was not decorative. It was functional. It was the fresh note in a kitchen that otherwise cooked from what had been preserved, dried, or stored, and it made a difference that was disproportionate to the size of the pots. Fresh herbs do something that dried herbs cannot do, and dried herbs do something that fresh ones cannot. and a cook who understands both uses both at the right moments. Dried herbs, they're essential oils concentrated by the removal of moisture, go into long braises and slow soups early in the cooking, where their flavor has time to bloom and mellow and integrate into the liquid over hours. Fresh herbs go in at the end, scattered over the finished dish, or stirred in at the last moment, contributing a brightness and a green, immediate fragrance that would be completely cooked away if they had been added at the beginning. Your grandmother knew this not as a rule, but as an observation, noticed over years of cooking, confirmed every time she scattered fresh parsley over a bowl of soup, and the soup became something more than it had been 30 seconds before. The mint made the afternoon tea what it was. A cup of hot water with a few fresh mint leaves pressed against the side of the cup and left to steep for 3 minutes was not the same beverage as mint tea made from a dried herb blend in a paper sachet. And your grandmother would not have argued the point because she did not consider it a point that required argument. It was simply obvious. The fresh leaf smelled alive. The dried sachet smelled of storage. Both were called mint tea. They were not the same thing. Chives were the easiest and most forgiving of the windowsill herbs, growing densely in a small pot and requiring almost no attention beyond occasional watering and regular cutting, the cutting itself being the encouragement to grow more. You snipped them with scissors directly over whatever was being made, baked potato or scrambled egg or cottage cheese, and they fell in small green rings that tasted of mild onion and looked like someone had made an effort, which you had, though the effort was so slight it barely counted. The rosemary was the one that required the most care and rewarded it most completely. A small branch of fresh rosemary bruised between the fingers and tucked under the skin of a chicken. Before roasting, changed the smell of the whole house as the bird cooked, the volatile oils carrying upward in the oven's heat and spreading through every room. A sprig added to roasting potatoes in the last 20 minutes of their cooking gave them a savory, resinous note that made them taste finished rather than merely cooked. Rosemary and bread dough, kneaded in and left to proof, produced a loaf that was already perfect before it was sliced. The window garden asked almost nothing. A little water, a little light, a little attention when the plant looked dry or crowded. In return, it gave the kitchen something that no dried herb jar and no produce aisle could quite replicate, which was the taste of something still alive, still growing, still close to the ground it had come from. In a kitchen built on preserved and stored and carefully managed resources, that aliveness was more than a culinary advantage. It was a daily reminder that summer was still possible, that things still grew, that the garden, even in January, had not entirely given up. And just like that, the kitchen light comes back on. Not the fluorescent hum of a modern kitchen at midnight, that cold blue-white glare that makes everything look like evidence. No, the warm amber glow of a single bulb above a porcelain sink, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look like it belongs exactly where it is. The cast iron on its hook, the wooden spoon in its crock, the vinegar on its shelf, the grease tin on the stove, patient and permanent and full. You have just spent time in one of the most honest rooms that ever existed in the American home. Not the most glamorous room, not the most modern, but the room that held everything together, quietly and without complaint. 3 times a day, every day, for decades. The room that knew your name before you were old enough to know it yourself. The room that smelled like the best version of every day you can remember from that time. 30 tricks, 30 habits, 30 pieces of knowledge that were never secret, never complicated, never particularly dramatic. They were just the way things were done by people who paid attention and could not afford not to. People who stood at stoves every morning and made something from what they had and fed whoever was at the table and then cleaned up and started thinking about the next meal. People who are mostly gone now, or very old, or remembered only in the particular way a smell can reach back through 40 years and put you somewhere specific. In a kitchen, at a table, with someone who is no longer there, but whose presence you can still feel in the way the room felt when they were in it. That is what this was really about. Not just the bacon grease tin or the cast iron, or the way a potato can pull salt out of an overseasoned soup. It was about the people who knew those things and used them every day and thought nothing of it, because to them it was just cooking, just cleaning, just keeping the household running the way a household was supposed to run. They did not know they were preserving something. They were not trying to. They were just doing what needed doing, the way they had always done it, the way their mothers had done it before them. But they were preserving something. They were preserving the knowledge that a kitchen is not just a room where food is prepared. It is the room where a family is made and remade every day at the stove and at the table, in the small acts of feeding and being fed that accumulate over years into something that holds people together long after the meals themselves are forgotten. The food was the vehicle. The care was the thing being delivered. And the tricks, all 30 of them, were simply the language the care was spoken in that kitchen, in that time. Take what you found useful here. Take it home. Put it to work. Try the float test on your eggs. Keep a dish of butter on the counter. Stretch the next chicken carcass into a pot of gold on the back burner. Wipe the cast iron while it is still warm. Add an eggshell to the grounds. Keep the vinegar where you can reach it. These are not antiques. They are not nostalgia dressed up as advice. They work. They worked then, and they work now, and they will work long after whatever is currently fashionable in the food world has had its moment and moved on. And if you try one of them, if you stand at your stove on a quiet evening and do something the old way for the first time, and it works, and the kitchen smells right, and you feel for a moment like you are standing in a room you have been in before, even though you have never been in that exact room, that is not your imagination. That is the kitchen recognizing you. That is 30 tricks, and the people who carried them reaching across time and saying yes. That is exactly it. You have it. Now keep going. If this is the first time you have found this channel, welcome. There is more where this came from. More rooms, more eras, more ordinary lives lived with an extraordinary attention to the small things that turned out to matter. Hit that subscribe button if you would like to come back, and we would love it if you did. Leave a comment below telling us which trick surprised you most, or which one you already knew because someone in your family used it, because those comments are the best part of this, truly. Reading the names your grandmothers and grandfathers go by in the comments, the particular details of the particular kitchens you are remembering right now. We read everyone. We are also on Spotify now if you prefer to listen. The link is in the description. Put it on in the kitchen while you cook. It seems like the right place for it. It is late now. The stove has been checked. The dish towels are hanging. The windows are cracked just enough for the kitchen to breathe. The light goes off. The room goes quiet. And somewhere, on a back burner in a kitchen that exists only in memory, but has never quite stopped running, something is still simmering. It will be ready in the morning. It always is. Good night.